second to allow Zoom to let everyone into this space. So we'll get started in just about 60 seconds. But welcome, thank you for being here. We'll get things going in just a minute. I'm just letting people come in. Hi, everybody. We'll get started in a minute. All right, I'll go ahead and kick things off, and then everyone else will keep coming into the room as we go. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot. I'm the Director of Events at Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., and I'd like to welcome you all to today's virtual event. Before we really begin, I just have a couple of technical details to go over with you. First, I will be dropping a link in the chat where you can purchase a copy of Power's new book, Saving Grace, from Politics and Prose's website. We ship to anywhere within the United States, and if you live in the DC area, you can select store pickup from any of our 3 store locations around DC. Also, if you have a question for the author, please submit it in the Q&A space. And if you're on a laptop, you can just hover over your bottom screen and you should see the Q&A. And we will get to those in the latter portion of the program. But whenever you have a question, you can submit it literally anytime between now and the end of the event. So go ahead and pop those in there throughout. Okay, now on to tonight's program. Kirsten Powers is a New York Times bestselling author, USA Today columnist, and senior political analyst for CNN, where she appears regularly on Anderson Cooper 360, CNN Tonight with Don Lemon, and The Lead with Jake Tapper. Her book, Saving Grace, Speak Your Truth, Stay Centered, and Learn to Coexist with People Who Drive You Nuts, offers a path to navigating the toxic division in our culture without compromising our convictions and emotional well-being. In the book, she uses her own experience as a journalist during the Trump era, interviews with experts, and research on what leads people to actually change their minds. Powers is in conversation with Eugene Scott, a national political reporter on the Washington Post breaking news team. He previously wrote about identity politics for The Fix and was host of the Next 4 Years podcast, available exclusively on Amazon Music. Scott was recently a fellow at the Georgetown University Institute of Politics, and prior to joining the Washington Post, he was a Washington correspondent at CNN Politics. So please help me welcome Kirsten and Eugene. And guys, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is so good to see you, Kirsten.
I know. I'm so happy that you're doing this with me.
Yeah, me too. I feel like the last time I saw you in person was at another book release.
Yes.
Of ours.
Washington life.
Yeah, very, very DC. It's so good though, to know that the pandemic hasn't stopped people from writing about things that matter and discussing these issues that, are just affecting so many of us, and maybe especially during this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's, I think that it's interesting. When I came up with this idea for this book was really sort of towards the end of 2018. And I would say at that time, I thought, well, we're at the worst place that we've been, that certainly in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think at the time I probably thought, well, this is probably as bad as it gets. And it's kind of interesting to look back now. And even as I was writing the book, I started to think, well, will this book even be relevant? I mean, things are going to, probably get better. And then, of course, who could have seen what was coming? There was no way. And so I was writing this book through all of that, and kind of came out on the other end and was like, wow, yeah, I think this is actually a super relevant topic.
Absolutely. If nothing more, because I think a lot of people felt the same way you did about, this is bad and this is our new normal, but didn't know how to move from that place to something more hopeful and something that left them less dreary and maybe even optimistic, which I think your book does a lot of. And
wow. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, no, I think, I personally have been thinking about grace a lot, and we're going to talk about that, in terms of your personal experiences and mine as well. But, just being down and, depressed and fatigued and exhausted about this literally changes nothing, if not makes matters worse.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And I think that was something that it sounds so obvious when you say it, right?
Yeah.
But when you're in the midst of it, the way I think everybody was, for us, it's a little different because we're living in it really, professionally as well.
Right.
So it's not just that, everyone's experiencing it because it's happening in the country. But then when you're actually living in it day by day, where you are forced to consume all the information, you're forced to interact, with me, I was having to go on TV and, have these conversations and walking away thinking, what is happening? I don't understand this. And I was anxious. And when I say anxious, I don't mean I was worrying a little bit. I'm talking clinical anxiety, right? Truly debilitating anxiety. I had chronic fatigue. I had fibromyalgia. I mean, my whole body was just absorbing all of this. And I didn't really know how to discharge it. And then I had this moment, and when I talk about it towards the end of 2018, when I just hit that wall and just said, this just isn't sustainable. I just can't keep doing this. It's not possible. And I started hearing from people around me saying the same thing. Like, I can't do this anymore, but I don't know what else to do. And then I had my kind of aha moment where I had this moment where I realized that a lot of the way I was thinking and a lot of the things that I was even saying or doing were not aligned with who I believed that I was and what I said I believed. Mm-hmm. And so I started to think, especially I'm a Christian, and I would think, I'm supposed to love my neighbor and love my enemies. And I was like, I'm so far away from that. Like, I can't even pretend that's something that I believe in. And I just had this realization that I need to figure out how to get aligned. Mm-hmm. And I had an intuition, because people say, where'd you come up with the idea of grace? Mm-hmm. And it was just an intuition. And I just had this intuition that it was grace, that I didn't have enough grace in my life for other people, and that I didn't see much grace in our culture. And so I ended up writing this column for USA Today and did a Twitter thread where I said, I feel like I'm contributing to a lot of the toxicity that's happening in this culture, and something has to shift. And I think that we need grace. Now, sitting where I'm sitting now, I didn't really even understand what I was saying, right? Because I think I was thinking of it in this kind of magical grace way, right? Like, great, you're going to sprinkle the grace on it and everything's going to be okay. But when I really had to sit down, when I decided to write this book, when I decided to really take a turn in my life, I had to figure out, I'm here. How do I get to here? I'm here. I really don't have grace for other people. And as I discovered, I don't even have grace for myself. Right. How do I get to here where I can actually practice grace? And so this book really is that story. It's the story of me figuring that out, of turning it into a practice, something that's actually like people have a yoga practice. I have a grace practice, right?
Well, that's interesting because, grace is a topic that Christians are pretty familiar with. And I would, argue that many of them think, I kind of know what that is, or I'm familiar with it, or I'm gracious. I don't need to study grace anymore. Not that people think they've arrived, but they certainly don't view it as a new idea. But you were coming back to this very fundamental idea that you were familiar with, and it seems like you were like, I really haven't grasped this the way that I thought I did.
Exactly, that's exactly right. I certainly, if you'd asked me if I thought I understood grace, I would have said yes. And I should be clear. I wrote the book in a way. I use the Christian paradigm for grace just because I think it's a really great paradigm. I think it's very different than the way we normally think about things in our culture, in the sense that it's unmerited favor, which means you don't earn it. And so we live in a society where we think everybody needs to earn everything. And so I really like that paradigm. But I wrote the book in a way that I hope, and I have heard from other people, that's very accessible to people of any faith or no faith at all. So it's not necessary for anybody to believe in Christianity or anything like that in order to, I think, gain something from this book. But when I started to really break that down, what does that mean? I realized that a lot of us think that grace means, whether you're Christian or not, we think it means being nice. We think it means kind of letting people do what they want and not really being held accountable and even being a doormat, right? And so when I really delved into it and I started to think about, well, what does it mean? What would it mean? Also, Christians, the other thing, Christians often only think about grace as grace comes from God to us. And then that's it. That's the end of the analysis, And so what does it mean if I was to give unmerited favor to another person? That would mean that they can't earn it. They can't earn my grace. I don't have to like them. They could be doing something that I disapprove of, but I still see the divine spark in them. I still see God in them. If you're not a believer, you just see the humanity in them. And that exists independent of anything they've done.
Yeah.
Right. They don't have to do anything to earn that. That's just, you just get that just for existing. And when you start to see people like that, then you start to see them in their fullness and their fullness of their humanity. And you don't reduce them down to the worst thing about them, the thing that you really, really don't like about them, which I definitely was doing. I definitely was just turning groups of people into one thing. And that was it. And there was nothing else. And I didn't really see individual people. And I noticed this was happening with a lot of other people. I also think grace can be a triggering word because a lot of people it's been weaponized against a lot of people. It's been weaponized against marginalized people. It's been weaponized, whether it's been against Black people or whether it's against women, right? There are different groups of people who have been told, you just need to show grace to the people who are mistreating you, who aren't listening to you, and all these other things. And that's just an abuse of the word. It's not, that's not what that means. And so people understandably sometimes will say, whoa, like I'm not, I think we need accountability right now. And one of my arguments is that accountability is grace.
Right. Because
when you think about Me Too, these men who went down spectacularly, right down here in their career, if back here someone would have held them accountable over probably a more minor thing that they did, and they only did one time, that would have been a grace because they would have actually learned something and they would have learned this isn't okay. We don't do this. We don't treat other people like this. And instead, there was never any accountability and they just went all this way. And then they just went out in a, spectacular, ball of fire. Right. And so it's not saying that people aren't accountable. It's more about how do we hold them accountable? Do we hold them accountable with humanity? Or do we hold people accountable like in a way that looks like annihilation, right? Where people do something wrong and we say, or they vote a way that we don't like, or whatever it is. And they just cease to even matter, right? So there's ways I think that when you use grace as a practice that can help us have that kind of accountability that we want to see, but also kind of protect other people's humanity and our own humanity.
There's a lot there, and I have so many questions tied to like so many of the points you made. But I wanted to go back to just how difficult 2018 was for you at the end that really made you think about writing this book. And I was kind of surprised that you said 2018 opposed to 2016, because as you're very vocal about, you're a Democrat. At the end of 2018, I think is when a lot of people began to feel some hope again after the 2018 midterms. As you discussed multiple times, a record number of women and LGBTQ people and other underrepresented groups, found themselves in Washington and state capitals finally being able to push back on much of what they found troublesome in the past. 2 years, but you still found yourself at the end of 2018 pretty discouraged. Is that what you were saying?
Well, I think, I was coming off of the Kavanaugh hearings, and
Okay.
I was on air all the time. And I think that for me, that was also sort of the period of Trump demonizing the caravans that were coming into the country. And I think it was just, it obviously started with 2016, but I think that 2016 was a shock to everybody's system, right? And so you kind of think, okay, I'm having a shock to my system, but it's gonna stabilize at some point, right? But it wasn't stabilizing, it was getting worse. And I was still continuing whatever was happening in the world. I was still having to have these conversations,
Right.
and then also, reckon with, I used to attend evangelical churches. And so I have a ton of friends who are from evangelical families, and just hearing, helping everybody process all the things that were happening, my friends with their parents, and the divisiveness, and there just was a lot going on. And I think that, and I think it was just wearing me down. What I found out when I really started delving into this, though, is that, I had a lot of unresolved trauma. And I think that made it very difficult for me to have grace for other people. And I have a whole chapter in my book about how trauma affects us. And most of us have trauma, and different people, but people respond to their trauma differently. And the way I responded to my trauma was this kind of, being very empathic, very, looking for the monsters, black and white kind of thinking, who's the bad guy, who's the good guy, not able really to see any nuances, and sort of catastrophizing. Not that things weren't catastrophic, but I'm just saying even more than maybe somebody else would.
Yeah.
So I think that what was happening to me was partly about what was happening in the world, but I was being uniquely triggered, right?
Yeah.
Like there wasn't something that was going to come in and make me say, this is okay, because I felt like things had gone so off course that I guess I honestly, even though I was saying I couldn't have imagined that it was going to get worse, I guess there was part of me that thought, I feel like we're just going in this direction that's not gonna, like we're in a nosedive, and like I don't see how the nose gets pulled up. It just felt, it just felt very hopeless to me. I felt very, very hopeless.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people felt that way. Quite frankly, there's been so much that has happened that I forgot that was the period where the caravans were dominating headlines.
It's impossible to keep track of all of it.
Yeah, no, it really, really is. I know I started 2018 writing about identity politics in the Trump administration and teaching about it at the college level. And I didn't realize until I got into therapy a little later that I was depressed during this whole period, and didn't really know what depression even looked like, and how to respond. And I know you can relate to this. You see your friends often say, I need a break from social media. And I'm like, what is that like? Tell me about being able to not tweet for a week. When your job involves you talking and writing about these every single day. And so you have to figure out ways to respond in a way that doesn't reflect, the nosedive that is happening, and you joining people, in the gutter of it all.
Yeah. Well, and I think that was where, so I actually did decide, and it was a matter, really for me, it was a matter of survival. The first thing I did was I got off of social media.
I remember you took a Twitter break.
Yeah. I just said, I can't do this. I am not going to, I tried cutting back. Right. And I was doing very well. And then, but something would happen, and someone would send me something, and I'd go in, and the next thing you know, it's like 3 hours later, and you're like, what in the world? Who am I? Like, am I 14? I don't understand. And so I finally just said, like, this is the last time that this is going to happen. This will not happen again. And so I had my fiance change my Twitter password, and I said, under no circumstances can you give this to me. And I never was a Facebook person, and I even stayed off of Instagram. So for, and I stayed off for about a month, and I can tell you within a couple of days, I felt like a different person. Awesome. And so and then after a month, I went back on, and I And I was like, this is just not a healthy place. It's just not a good place for me. And so I don't spend a lot of time there, but when I do, I've set sort of some boundaries and rules around, like, I'm not going to argue with people. I'm not going to try to convince people of something, because that's not what people do on Twitter. Like, I might go there to find out what's happening in the world. But, one of the chapters I talk about is everybody has to do their own sort of assessment of what they can tolerate, like how much you can take in, and that we should all have the goal of being informed and engaged. But anything past that, we don't really need. And so that moment where you're starting to feel that activation, and you're starting to feel the judgment and the contempt and all of the kind of anti-grace stuff, is when you now are starting to get entangled with these other people. And so grace is like creating that space between you and the other person that says, that's yours. Like, I don't have to take that on. I can recognize it and I can do something about it. If it's me, maybe I'll write a column about it, right? Or maybe I'll integrate it into my commentary on TV. If it's another person, maybe they'll say, I see something that's happening that's very harmful here. I'm going to give money to an organization to help combat this kind of behavior. I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to amplify voices, that are helping call attention to this in a way that's not toxic, right? Because there are plenty of people on social media who aren't being toxic. Right. And so, and recognizing that social media is not all good or all bad. So it's, it can be incredibly toxic, and it's also a revolutionary tool that has literally changed the world, right? So it's both things. We just have to figure out how much can we take in until we start spewing it back out at people. Yeah. And I just find I can't take in that much, and I have to take it in mostly through reading. I find reading less activating. And so, and then but if I was sitting on Twitter all day, it'd be very hard for me to offer grace to other people. Oh yeah. Because the whole system would be so jacked up from what's going on. It's designed to get us jacked up on outrage, right? And so it's designed to make our brains start demonizing people and start looking for the monster. And so, so for me to practice grace, I have to be very careful about what I let into my body.
Yeah, absolutely. In your mind. And I think for me, what really helped me put social media in perspective is just getting in meaningful relationships with people who just aren't on it as much as you and I are. I mean, I remember when I was at CNN with you, and during breaking news, I worked the earliest shift. My shift started at 6 because the former president would start tweeting at 5. And so I had no clue what it was like to not be on social media, but there are people who do. And, when I would be outraged and frustrated like you, I'd be telling people these stories, and they just didn't understand why I was a big deal, and they feel a bit silly. And I'm like, this person said that, blah, blah, blah. And you just realize how out of control your usage of this platform is, and how your perspective just was just so tainted. And
it's so funny. It reminds me of this, like after I had been off of it for a while, and one of my friends who, actually, I was having brunch with her, and she comes in and she sits down and she's like, this. And I said, what's going on? And she said, well, this is happening on Twitter that such and such is saying. And she starts telling me some crazy story. And then she just gets done and she looks at me, and I said, I am so glad that I have no idea what you're talking about. Because this is again, like what I think of grace is such a great tool, where like I said, the minute you start judging and having contempt for these people, you're now taking them to brunch.
Yeah.
They're sleeping in your bed with you. They're, living in your head rent free. And it's like, versus just recognizing it and being discerning and saying no. And that's what I do when I go on Twitter now. So I see something that I think that in the past I would have been like, I'm just like, no. And I'm going to keep moving, and I'm going to do the things that I think are helpful. This is, again, it doesn't mean there's never anything that you should say something about. Sometimes there are things that you need to weigh in on, so, I got back on social media during Black Lives Matter. Actually, I got back on when Ahmaud Arbery was killed. So I had been off, I was writing my book, and one of my friends texted me and said, told me what had happened and said, please say something, and so I was like, you're right. I'm going to break this fast that I'm doing. And I got back on, and then I did stay on for a while. So, and I think that was a good use of time, and so I think I was amplifying things, and I was trying to inform the people who follow me and all of those other things. So it's not an all or nothing.
Right.
But it is, we do have to always be thinking, if we want to be able to have grace for other people, then we just have to be conscious about, are we consuming a lot of information that's getting us amped up about other people? I mean, I cite a social scientist in the book that calls, a lot of the people on social media rhetorical dope peddlers. And that people were always concerned about the other people's rhetorical dope peddler. We always have a lot to say about that, but he says the rhetorical dope peddler you need to watch out for is the one that's selling to you.
Yeah.
That there actually are people that are intentionally amping you up. And so I did curate my feeds, for people who are, okay, who's going to inform me and who's going to get me like amped up, walking away thinking those bad people, I hate them, and all of those things.
No, that's very important. I will say one way that social media, helped me not engage in all of these arguments that we can find on Twitter is my fear that I could be arguing passionately with a bot.
Oh, that's funny.
And to think that I could be worked up by something not even real.
You know what? That's a real thing.
It's a very real thing.
Are around, are being driven by bots or paid trolls who don't even barely speak English, and are just saying things and getting everybody riled up. And and people, a lot of times people will say like, oh, you're getting ratioed. I'm like, yeah, by bots and trolls.
Yes.
It's like, can we be honest about what's happening here? It's not like most of these people are not actually sincerely expressing their feelings, So I think that, so getting off of social media was one. Dealing with my trauma, which was huge, absolutely huge and transformative. Finding a therapist who was trauma informed and was to say, recognize a lot of my behavior was growing out of unintegrated trauma, learning to use boundaries instead of demonizing. And so I do think boundaries are an act of grace, where you let people know. Sometimes people think of boundaries. I used to think of boundaries this way. It's a way to keep people out, and they're actually a way to let people in. Because you're saying to people, like, I'm willing to interact with you, but these are just the boundaries around how I'm willing to interact. And so a boundary for me might be, you can't speak to me with contempt. You can't gaslight me. You can't, these are some things, and those are my boundaries. And, if you want to be in relationship with me or even in conversation with me, you have to honor these. And if you don't, then you don't.
Yeah. And that's the choice that you've made, not you, but they've made, to in relationship.
And so, or a boundary around, somebody who in the past would have sent me just into a spiral for days, to just say, I'm just a no to that. That's just, I'm a no to that. And I'm not giving you any more of my brain space. Like, you don't get to take up my brain space. If I'm going to think about it, it's going to, because I'm thinking about a way to combat the thing that you did. Right. And so I say, like, figure out what you're a no to, and then figure out what you're a yes to. Because once you know what you're a no to, there's always a yes over here that you can be doing, where you can actually be making a difference, and not just, stewing in contempt and, getting a migraine and body pain and all the other things that come with it.
So can you talk a bit about your journey in being more gracious towards yourself, which is something I think I was reading in your book, and I've been thinking about a lot in the past few months, because I think we often initially think about grace as something we need to extend to other people, not realizing that we are often in need of grace ourselves, not just from other people, but from ourselves.
Yes, that was such a revelation for me, because I wasn't even aware of what was happening, how my inner critic was, and how mean I was to myself, and that honestly I didn't like myself. I mean, I really had to come to terms with that. I was like, I'm really mean to myself, and I really don't like who I am. One of the things that I did when I started, what led up to me actually writing that column that I wrote where I talked about the toxicity and me contributing to it, I spent about that month, once I got off of Twitter, really trying to reckon with how I've contributed to the public debate. And so I kind of went back through over the last 10, 15 years and started looking at things. And, and I looked at my last book, I write about this in there, and I was like, wow, I just really got some things wrong. And, and sometimes I got things substantively wrong. And sometimes just my tone was just unacceptable. And, my snarkiness and these other things. And so I actually started to just feel so much shame.
Yeah.
And so I was talking to my friends about it, and I was talking to my therapist about it. And then they started saying the same thing, which is, well, where's the grace for Kirsten?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yeah, but I shouldn't have done this. And they're like, right. But, one of the things that the quotes that I use to kind of give the people a sense of what grace is the Maya Angelou quote of, you did the best you could with the tools that you had. And then when you knew better, you did better.
Right.
And so, like my therapist said, that Kirsten was doing the best she could.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you're judging her from a healthier version of you. But you have to have grace for her, because that she really was doing the best that she could.
Mm-hmm.
And that I was like, wow, you're right. Like, because I had gotten to a point where I was starting to extend that to other people. I would be like, well, that person's just doing the best they can with the tools they have. And it's not very good, and it doesn't mean they're not accountable for it, but I can see that is the best they can do. And so, I started to be able to have more grace for myself. And, my inner critic is almost non-existent now. I really don't. It's just that kind of thinking is honestly too discordant with who I am today.
Okay.
I'm just such a different person than I was when I started this process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I started thinking about it, I thought, like, yeah, how would you be able to have grace for other people if you couldn't have grace for yourself?
Right.
Because, when I went through that process and started reckoning where I had gone wrong, then I was able to look at another person who had done something and say, I kind of know what that's like.
Right.
I know what it's like to really screw up and do something really stupid and not even realize that you did it.
Mm-hmm.
I know what it's like to be acting out of pain. That I'm not even aware that I even have. And so it makes it possible for me to be more empathetic with people, and still recognize that sometimes there will be consequences for that behavior. But how do we hold people accountable with humanity? Right. That's more the question. And I point in the book to our criminal justice system as a great example of where people say, well, do the crime, do the time, So, and it's like, yeah, but like, really, they need to go to jail for the rest of their lives. Like, and they need to be in this like completely inhumane, like building and system and the way that they're treated. And that's not accountability. That's annihilation.
And it's not justice. And I think a lot of people have had to rethink, what is a just response to a wrongdoing, and in ways that we previously had not, because there's so many other factors that need to be considered, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, or the way, we label people, somebody who has done a crime becomes they're a criminal
forever.
It's like somebody who murders somebody is a murderer. And it's like, actually, people their lives can be redeemed.
Right.
These could be opportunities for intervention, and instead these are opportunities, to really to oppress people and to mistreat them and treat them inhumanely and just throw them away. I mean, like, they're just disposable, right?
Yeah, and you have a chapter about people not being disposable, which I think is an idea that needs to be reinforced. How often do you hear things like, this person's dead to me, or I am done with that person, or there's just no grace or no second chance?
Right. They're trash, like, or whatever it is. They're just, yeah. And I think that and look, those are normal feelings to have. I don't want to say I'm very pro feeling. I'm not saying to anybody to feel, you can't feel certain things. Of course, we all feel these things. I'm not going to say I'm never going to have contempt again. That's unrealistic. What happens now is that I notice it. Whereas in the past, it just happened. It was like breathing. I didn't even think anything of it. I just thought, well, that's what you do when somebody is a bad person. You have contempt for them, right? And now I notice it. And so I think it's more about noticing it. And it's more about then what do you do with that? But yeah, that recognizing that every person has a story, everybody's fighting a battle we don't know about. All these kind of cliche things that we hear are actually true.
Very true. Very true.
And that my guiding principle really is do unto others as you would have done to you. And so when you want to call somebody out, when you want to hold somebody accountable, ask yourself, how would I want to be treated if I messed up like this?
Yeah.
Would I want an opportunity to do better? I cite a professor from Smith, Loretta Ross, and she believes in calling in. And so she said, before you call somebody out, take the time to have the conversation with them and let them know that they've done something that's problematic and give them an opportunity to do better. Right. But instead, a lot of times it becomes, this is an opportunity to, prove that I'm on the right side or that I'm doing the right things or whatever it is. And so just think like if I messed up, if I tweeted something I shouldn't have tweeted, what would I like to happen? Personally, I would like somebody to reach out to me and say you shouldn't have done that. And I've had that happen. And I write about it in the book, where a Black girlfriend called me up and said, you wrote something on your blog and I don't think I don't think it's okay. And I think you need to take it down. I was like, okay, I took it down and I heard her, and we had a conversation about it. And it's, if you have that opportunity, and then if the person ignores it, then you may have to escalate.
Yeah.
You may have to escalate it. And I also want to say, some people listening to this might say, you know what, I don't have the energy. I've had these conversations. I'm done explaining to people what's not okay. And I think that that's fair. And I think that, and that's where there's a couple of things I would say. One is you could consider going to somebody who's maybe an ally and asking them, so say if it's me and there's somebody doing something sexist, I could maybe go to a male friend and say like, could you talk to this person, please? Because I don't have the energy for it. At the same time, if you don't have the energy for it and you don't even have the energy to do that, and then you react in an angry way, I would actually argue in that case, the person who's getting angry and has been pushed to the edge is actually the person who needs the grace. But what we usually say is the person who caused the harm needs the grace, right? We usually say, why are you canceling that person? Show them grace. And it's like, well, what about this person over here who's been mistreated? And as part of a group of people who's been being mistreated for generations and has been asking for and demanding to be treated differently, and nobody's listening.
Right.
So in why do you automatically go to this person needs grace, versus this person over here, who, by the way, has been already offering tons of grace.
Right. I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier, 2 points about you doing the best, being the best Kirsten that you could have in that moment. And everyone has a story that causes them to respond in particular ways. And that made me think about how you wrote about your relationship with your mom, and to extend grace to her, and how difficult of a process that had been for, huge chunks of time in your life.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you found it easier or more difficult to extend grace to someone so close to you compared to a stranger, or someone who had been so foundational in shaping your worldview, opposed to someone who's been on the opposite side of you, for all of their life, perhaps. What you tell us about that process for you?
I think that when it involves family members and people that you're really close to, those can be the hardest relationships. I don't think that I ever even really tried to offer her grace, because I didn't really think about grace that way until I wrote this book. And so it wasn't until I was writing this book that I realized realized that. And somebody asked me in another interview, they said, what would you say is the difference between forgiveness and grace is? And I said, I think the story of my mom is a good example of it, because I would have said that I forgave her, right? So we always had a very, very hard relationship. And, we managed to stay in a relationship, but it was always very difficult. And I felt sort of robbed, right? Like, why didn't I get the mom that everybody else got? And the mom who thinks you're the best thing that ever happened, and all that kind of stuff. And so I always, and so there would have to be kind of continued forgiveness. It's not like a one-time deal. And then when I was towards the end of the book, I was sitting on the sofa and I was thinking about my mother, and I thought, and all of a sudden I just had this like vision of her, being like a young mother. She got pregnant with me, and wasn't married. She ended up marrying my father. She came from a Catholic family. And then ended up having my brother. And the truth of the matter is, if she would live today, she probably never would have gotten married, and she probably never would have had kids. Right. And she was sort of pushed into this very conventional life that she never would have chosen for herself. She was living somebody else's life. And by the time she figured that out, I think she did figure it out. By the time she figured it out, she had 2 kids and a husband. And so, and I had so much empathy for her and compassion for her. And then also knowing what that era was like for women,
right.
And here she was, getting a PhD and becoming an archaeologist and moving to Alaska and all these things. And her parents didn't approve. And I had so much empathy and compassion for her. I got to this point where I was like, I don't even need to forgive her, because she was doing the best she could. Like, there's nothing to forgive. It was just such a weird paradigm shift for me, where I was like, it's like with grace, it is like, you don't actually owe me that, because how could you have done any better than what you did? Like, I 100% believe that she was doing the best she could. I just do. And it's, even though it wasn't that great. And even she would say that today, and so, but it really took me marinating in grace and this idea, and thinking about this and doing all of this work, through therapy, and I'm meditating and all of these other things, and really getting grounded, that I got to that place where I had the capacity to kind of have that kind of grace, right? To just say, like I say in the book, grace is creating space for other people to not be you. So rather than me saying, well, if I had been her, I would have done this, and I would never do that to a child, and I would never talk to a child. It's just like, well, she's not me.
Right. Right.
And I'm sure I've done a lot of things that she wouldn't do. And so, it completely transformed our relationship.
I was going to ask, how did she respond to that shift?
So I wrote her, I told my therapist about it, and she said, did you tell her? And I said, no. And she said, I think you should write her a letter and tell her. And so I did. And in the letter I said, I think I can't remember if I wrote about it in the book or not, but I never could have imagined saying this. I just said, I see all the good things that I got from you. That, I learned about feminism and social justice and equality and all of these things. My mother was very ahead of her time, and I learned all these things, and and I said, I know our relationship has been very difficult for both of us, and I'm glad we didn't give up on each other. And I said, and I'm glad you're my mom, because like, I wouldn't be me if you hadn't been my mom. And she was really touched and shocked. She called me and she just said, I'm just so glad that, she's 83, and she said, I'm just so glad that we have whatever little time we have left, that we can have a different kind of relationship. And
That's awesome. That really is. When I was reading the story, it's very clear that she shaped you very early in so many ways in terms of worldview and values. And I think that sometimes, makes it very difficult for some of us to understand why this very influential person is also so difficult in these other ways. I think you said something like there's a difference between bad people and bad decisions
Yeah.
in one of your chapters. And I think we really want to, make people just bad because of their decisions. But you write about how it's much more complex than that.
Yeah, it is. And also I think that what makes a person be a person who maybe isn't a good parent, right? Like what happens, what happened to my mother? Like what were the what were her woundings? And I have a little more information about that than I used to have, right? And so to understand that when you think of it as people doing the best they can, is just not thinking, because we often think what I would do. Right. And it's like, no, it's what they could do and what they have the capacity to do. And I don't even really believe in bad people anymore. I believe that there are people who do bad things. But I don't think that people at their core are necessarily bad. I think everybody has the capacity. One of the theologians that I interviewed, Willie James Jennings, who is at Yale Divinity School, and he's one of the leading theologians on liberation theology. And he said that, grace is looking at somebody that you may not like and that you may even hate, but seeing the possibility in them and seeing the possibility of a relationship or the possibility of what could be, right? And I think that as much as people, and I've had a lot of people push back on this idea, as much as people push back on it, I just think it's a very transcendent, like beautiful idea. And I feel like it is what we kind of, if we're honest with ourselves, yearn for. It's something that's more meaningful than what we're doing right now. And that a lot of what we're doing because it makes us feel safe.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. We're trying to protect ourselves from people that, have caused harm or, present as potentially harmful very often.
Yeah. Yeah. And to feel, sometimes also to feel connected to other people. I talk about how I engaged in a lot of, some of it was kind of almost like trauma bonding, honestly, over how traumatized I was and other people were. But Brene Brown calls common enemy intimacy. And so it's a fake intimacy, but it feels real. And so that's when we bond over hating the same people.
Right.
And so a lot of people have these relationships where it's like, well, this is my tribe and my community, and we all hate all the same people, and we're really tight. And it's like, but that's just fraudulent intimacy. That's not real. That's not real intimacy. And so, there's a lot of things that we're confused about, I guess I would say. And, I have this chapter on trying to unlearn binary thinking and, putting things in all or nothing. It's like, it doesn't mean you can never talk to somebody about, people who are triggering you or upsetting you. It's like, but if your whole identity is hating a group of people, which for a lot of Americans it is, you're in kind of dangerous territory. And, I go back to like MLK when he said, hate is too great a burden to bear. He was saying like, it's a burden to bear, and you're bearing it, not the other people. Right. And so I don't want to bear that. I don't want to walk around bearing hatred. Right. It's just not the kind of, I ultimately just got to a point where I was like, who do I want to be?
Yeah.
What do I want to do here, on this earth? And what I was doing just wasn't it.
Yeah. I imagine that a big part of that revelation is at least knowing who you do not want to be. And to try to, not be that person. And I want to get to a couple questions we have. Some you've answered, which is really awesome. But one that I think people obviously very familiar with your writing and your political commentating would ask is, what is the grace you found yourself able to give Donald Trump?
Yeah. So I feel like when people bring up Donald Trump, I feel like if you're going to start practicing grace, don't start with Donald Trump, because that's kind of like, I'm going to take up running and the first race is going to be the Boston Marathon. So
Yeah.
like don't start there. Like start
Yeah.
with your cousin with the
That's real,
problematic
though. Yeah.
beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that I would say that on my best day, I can look at him and say, this is a person who is doing the best he can, but it's not good and it's not okay and it's harmful, and he should be held accountable for his behavior and not go down the path of what I used to do, which is really hating and being filled with contempt. So it's not that I see him in some like rosy, situation, but that I can see the humanity in him, and see that, like, obviously something happened to him, but he's a grown up and he's responsible for that. One of my friends who is a pastor and who was just out of his mind after Trump became president, he said he was like online, just acting crazy, just doing all of these things. And he realized he was just kind of out of control. And so he found a picture of Donald Trump when he was 7 years old. And whenever he would do it, he would look at him and be like, he's a person, like, he's, just to pull him back from the ledge. And so that you can, because again, you go back to hate is too great a burden to bear. It is me hating Donald Trump affecting Donald Trump. He doesn't care. It's me, it's hurting me. And so, but I think that fortunately for me, I don't have to really talk about him that much anymore, or think about him that much more. That was much harder to deal with when he was president, right? But I think that what most of us are dealing with, yes, even when he was president, most of us are dealing with him being president, but most of what people talk to me about are their relationships. It's their parents, it's their coworker, it's their friend. That's really where I think people need to start, and that is where most of the people are having the most trouble. Don't go immediately to probably the most difficult case, I would say.
Yeah, no, and that brings me to another question. It's November, we're headed to the holidays, and one writer has asked, do you have any recommendations for practicing grace with family members over the holiday season?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just a lot of things that we talked about here, and it's, speed read my book because I have a lot of things in there. I would say, because it's coming up so soon, the first thing is make a decision that you want to practice grace, right? Make a decision that I'm going to try to do things differently. And I'm going to, when I look at my mom, when she's saying the things that are really upsetting to me, and I'm going to see her as more than the things that she's saying, right? I'm going to see her as the person who wiped away my tears when I was a child, who went to all my games and cheered for me and all these other things, right? Doesn't mean it's okay that she's saying these things. Then boundaries, really get clear about what your boundaries are. And if you don't have the capacity, and you know that your parents can't have this conversation, have a conversation before you go home and say, can we put some boundaries up around what we're going to talk about when I come home? And I don't want to talk about politics over Thanksgiving, or I do want to talk about politics over Thanksgiving, but I want to set these boundaries around it. We're going to agree that we're not going to speak to each other with contempt. We're going to agree that, if things get too heated, we're going to take a break. So there are ways to create boundaries. And so I have a chapter on embracing healthy conflict. Really learn how to have healthy conflict, because I think a lot of us don't know how to do that. How do you talk to a person who thinks differently than you without insulting them or making them feel like you're talking down to them? How do you become a peacemaker? Somebody who comes in and talks about hard things, like has conflict. That's what peacemaking is. And a conversation where healthy conflict has occurred, both people will walk away and they'll say, I may not have changed my mind, but I felt heard, I felt seen, and I might have learned something. And then finally, I also have in there a lot of social science around how people change their minds. And so to really familiarize yourself with when you're dealing with somebody who holds a really problematic view that really does need to be dealt with, because some things, there's some disagreements you can agree to disagree. And then there's some other things where if you ignore it, other people are going to suffer.
Right.
Learn how to have those conversations, which we don't have time for, but there's a lot of social science around it. And amazingly, it's not calling people names or yelling at them. So it's like, there are actually ways to do that. And so, those would be like, I think, quick things that you could do. And I would dial down social media, if not get off of it entirely before you go home, because you're gonna see something that's gonna get you going, and then you're gonna want to go to the person and be like, you know what your people are doing,
right?
What your people are saying. Can you defend that? Right? I would just stay away from the rhetorical dope peddlers, and and try to see the people that you're dealing with as more than just the thing that is making you angry.
Yeah. You've mentioned before, how Martin Luther King has influenced some of your views, and Brene Brown and her podcast. One of the viewers wants to know, are there any other books or leaders that, have shaped your views on grace that you can recommend in addition to your book?
Yeah, I mean, I highly recommend any MLK, like an MLK anthology, and read that. John Lewis was so inspiring to me, especially because he's somebody that, is contemporary to us until he passed away. And you're able to see a person who had, literally been through hell, who just exuded grace and joy. And not that I'll ever be like him, but I just was like, wow, there are people who can do this. I also really like someone named Tara Brach. She's a meditation teacher, and it's sort of in the Buddhist strain, I would say. Yes, Brene Brown, anything by Brene Brown, I think is really, really helpful. But I would kind of think of like, who do I want to be, and who are some people who model that, and then try to read as much as you can about how they were able to do that, because there are models out there of people who have faced down really horrific things, and have not become bitter or hateful, or any of those other things. So yeah, but I would, MLK just all the way.
Yeah. No, this has been a really awesome discussion. I have obviously more questions, but the good thing about you, for me and for other people viewing, is that you are still accessible via social media.
Yes.
And this is something you're going to be talking about for quite some time, because as we know, we're heading into midterm season. I mean, today is election day. And so we will find ourselves, needing very much so many of the tips you've given us so far. And so I really want to thank you for writing about this.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was really, really meaningful. And thank you to everybody who joined us.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you to both of you for this conversation. Like Eugene just said, it's so timely, not only with the elections, but with the holidays coming up. And so I said it in the chat, but there is a link to purchase the book, and it makes a great holiday gift, maybe for someone who doesn't always treat you with grace. Hint, hint, maybe.
Exactly.
So pick that up at the link in the chat. And thank you guys so much again for this talk.
Thank you.
Awesome. And before we go, Kirsten, is today publication day?
It is. Today's
awesome. Congrats. Such a big day.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. This is a great way to start it.
Awesome.
So. Thank you guys all for coming tonight. We hope that you stay well and stay well read, and we'll see you next time.